you very much for that very kind introduction and great explanation, really, in summary of my book. I'm delighted to be here and honored um, by the club to have been asked to talk about the book. And it's very gratifying to see such interest. I'm now going to share the screen as there are visuals to go along with my talk. And there we are. I'd like to begin um, by discussing the origins of the book briefly and also the literary form of biography. Um, as you will learn more details later, my parents divorced when I was very young, and I saw my father seldom in the years of growing up. He became very ill, in part due to his war experience in the 1970s, and he died in 1979 at the age of 65. Several years after his death, I realized that his second wife, whom he'd married in 1951, had received the widow's pension that came with his veteran's status. And I felt that this was not fair to my mother, who had been the one who'd suffered through the war years while my father was away and captured and possibly never coming home. I sat down to write a submission then to the Bureau of Pensions Advocates, where I was going to put the case that my mother deserved some of the pension. I thought that the submission would take a weekend to write, and I found I was wrong. It took me 6 weeks and a lot of research and a lot of heartache. Uh, and when I finished, I reflected on the fact that writing a biography, unlike autobiography or memoir or indeed fiction, in which cases the author is in full control, with a biography, you are not. There are always doors, or at least a single door, that you can never open about the person you're writing about. While I was doing the research for that submission, one of my father's comrades from the war, George Pollock, an American naval officer, replied to me and he said, "I assume this is for a biography." And I'm afraid I had to disappoint him. To try and understand the trauma my father had gone through for 4 years was beyond me at that age. But in the years that followed, I continued to assemble information about him, to interview people who knew him, to find letters, and went forward thinking about what his life had been. But my understanding of um, what a biography's constraints were um, came to me just a few weeks ago reading, and I'll read it to you. It's a bit highfalutin, but by the great literary critic James Wood on the subject of biography. And he wrote, "Because we are not God, our narration of another's life is a pretense of knowledge, simultaneously an attempt to know and a confession of how little we know." That certainly was my difficulty. However, some years ago, another veteran friend of my father was writing a book about Allied prisoners who fought back during their incarceration. It was called They Never Surrendered. And he asked me to do the chapter on the doctor, on my father. I sat down, and in 2 weeks, I'd written 20,000 words. The floodgates had opened. And I think what motivated me at this stage in my life was the recognition that uh, the younger generations of the Reid families, and I have 5 siblings, 4 of them are half siblings, and my brother, that the younger generation should know about my father. So, this book, The Captain Was a Doctor, my version of my father's life, is my attempt to know him, but also my confession of all the things that I could never know about him. So, with that said, the facts then, as we know them, are as follows. John Reid, known to his family and his friends as Jack, was born in Toronto in 1913. He grew up in the west end of Toronto, an only child. His parents Harry and Olive Reid were loving parents. His father was a employee of eventually the Canadian Linotype Company and became a successful executive in that company. Jack's mother, Olive, was a housewife and a lover of literature and music and art, and encouraged her son in those activities. So he attended Runnymede School. He went to UTS for high school and was a very successful student. In this picture, you can see him at UTS. He's holding the 1930 basketball, and I guess he was the captain of the team. He was successful at school and proceeded to the University of Toronto to take medicine. While he was in second years, he had a momentous year in 1933. Here you can see him with his family. I will point out Jack is here in the middle in the white trench coat. His father, Harry, is to his left. I don't know this person, and this is his mother, Olive. Jack was enrolled in the medical school at U of T, and in 1933, as he did in the summers during university, was planning to go to Muskoka, where he and other friends had a summer shack that they stayed in. But in the March of that year, 1933, his mother was suddenly taken ill and died of a cerebral embolism. This was crushing to him. He was very close to his mother, and that left he and his father rattling around in their house together in their sadness. But the following summer, 1933, he was at Foots Bay in Muskoka, and during the summer met Jean Hodge, my future mother. From that time on, Jack and Jean were a golden couple, never apart. While he was studying medicine, she was pursuing her own artistic activities. And when he graduated from medicine in 1939, they were married in that June. This was a strange time to be married. 2 months after their wedding, the Second World War began. My father and his medical colleagues were in the first stages of their training, and though the war had begun, the plan for most of these men was to continue with the training that they'd planned. So my father, for the first year of their marriage, was a senior intern at Toronto General Hospital. In the second year, he chose to take a residency in Vancouver, where they moved for a year. During this time, as most of you probably know, the war, first of all, was in a stasis period, the Phony War, which went from 1939 until June 1940, when all hell broke loose. That was when the Nazis attacked all of Western Europe. The withdrawal from Dunkirk took place at the end of June, and the Battle of Britain began in July, that ran through until October, when Hitler was trying to invade Britain with Operation Sea Lion, but failed because of the effects of the RAF. That year, 1940-41, my father was in Vancouver with his wife, with the plan to join the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps at the end of his residency. And in August 1941, he went to Ottawa with friends, other medical friends, and joined up. What was unknown at that time was the situation in the Pacific. By now, Britain and the Commonwealth were standing alone against the Nazis. But in the Pacific, there was a different problem boiling up. Japan had been, for almost 10 years, on the warpath. Their concept was something called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And this was an idea of repelling the colonizing Western European countries from the Asian countries and taking over their destiny. Though it sounded good, it was in fact Japan's effort to become the head of this conglomeration and to control it. Japan's problem at this time was lack of raw materials. And in search of them, they had invaded Manchuria in 1931. They invaded China in 1937. This is when the famous rape of Nanking took place, and at least 300,000 Chinese were murdered over 6 weeks during that invasion. And by 1941, when my father was training, things had got very sticky between Britain and the US and Japan with respect to their designs in that part of the world. The US and Britain both imposed sanctions on Japan for the invasions and eventually the French Indochina invasion that they took place in 1940, which angered the Japanese. And their reasoning was they finally had to take control of the Pacific. This was all being discussed and negotiated and not settled during the time that my father was training at Lansdowne Park in Ottawa. This slide shows a page from the Star Weekly of September 27th, 1941. These are a group of doctors who are training. My father is on the left here where I'm pointing, and behind him is Gordon Gray, the other one who took the tropical diseases course that Mary Frances referred to. And these two men were to find themselves chosen when the next development took place. And that development was the reinforcement of Hong Kong. In January 1941, Winston Churchill had said it was nonsense, that if the Japanese attacked, Hong Kong could never be held. But during the time that Reid and his friends were training, the commander who had just retired, Arthur Grissett, General Grissett, who was in fact a Canadian, passed through Canada and saw his old friend Harry Crerar, who was chief of staff here in Canada. They were old Upper Canada friends. They were had been at Royal Military College in Kingston together. And Grissett talked to Crerar about his ambition to reinforce Hong Kong because he believed a couple of battalions would make all the difference. When Grissett got back to England, the first reaction to his idea was negative, but within 10 days, the chiefs of staff in Britain had changed their minds. And in fact, their submission to Prime Minister Churchill mid-month was that 2 battalions would be a very good idea, and the Canadians seemed willing to supply them. And so it happened. The Canadians accepted the chore, and Mackenzie King and James Ralston, who was the Minister of Defense, set things in motion. And just as this group of men finished their training, the 2 battalions were chosen, the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. My father was attached to the Winnipeg Grenadiers and Gordon Gray to the Royal Rifles. And the next thing they knew, they were on their way to Vancouver. This picture of my father is his Karsh picture, his portrait, just before he left in September 1941. The force left Vancouver on October 27th, 1941. There were 1,975 men and 2 nursing sisters. One big problem as they set sail was that all of their transport, their armored carriers, their light and heavy trucks, their water carriers, all of those vehicles, 212 of them, did not make the voyage. They were put on another ship and eventually reached Manila long after the Battle of Hong Kong took place. So what you're seeing here are the 2 battalions arriving in Hong Kong on November 16th, 1941, marching on their way to Sham Shui Po Barracks in Kowloon in northern off the island. Here we have a picture of Hong Kong Island. I'm showing you here, Kowloon across the bay, and these are the new territories. At this point, the British intelligence had no idea that the 38th Division of Japan was just north of this border here, and 60,000 battle-hardened troops were prepared to be part of what was going to be a concerted assault to open the seaways from Japan south to Indonesia, what was then Malaysia and Dutch East Indies, where the rubber, tin, and oil that they needed was to be found. The, the attack took place here in Hong Kong on December 8th, a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and as well as attacks that were going on in British Malaya. Um, the, the battle, I'll explain very quickly, happened in three phases. The, the, the defenses north of Hong Kong Island, and we're now, this is called Kowloon, and this is the New Territories. The red that you see here is what was called the gin drinkers line, and this was supposed to be a defense line that would hold for at least a week. With the assault from the north, this crumpled in about 40 hours, and the Japanese then took control of the mainland completely. Over the next 6 days, they bombarded with cannon and aircraft the island, where the entire force had retreated from the New Territories to defend what was the only place they could now disport themselves. In this map picture, you can see this was the route the Japanese took. They landed on the North Shore. This was terrible fighting. Hong Kong is very mountainous. It's very difficult to move around up and down the hills. The men in the Canadian groups were without their transport, and therefore they were doing a lot of things on foot or with vehicles. The Canadians had been stationed in the lower east and west quadrants. So the Royal Rifles were here, the Winnipeg Grenadiers in this part of the island. And on December 18th, when the Japanese invaded, the fighting became extremely difficult. I can read now, after a certain number of days of fighting, this would be now December 23rd, Churchill sent to Mark Young, who was the governor, the following message. He said, "There must be no thought of surrender. Every part of the island must be fought and the enemy resisted with the utmost stubbornness. The enemy should be compelled to expend the utmost life and equipment. There must be vigorous fighting in the inner defenses, and if need be, from house to house. Every day that you are able to maintain your resistance, you help the Allied cause all over the world. And by a prolonged resistance, you and your men can win the lasting honor, which we are sure will be your due." 2 days later, Governor Mark Young broadcasts the following message to the island, to the defenders, who were by this time as beleaguered as possible. He said, "In pride and admiration, I send my greetings this Christmas Day to all who are fighting and all who are working so nobly and so well to sustain Hong Kong against the assaults of the enemy. Fight on, hold fast for King and Empire. God bless you all in this your finest hour. Let this day be historical in the grand annals of our empire. The order of the day is to hold fast." The surrender took place that very afternoon. The following few weeks were a very dismal time for all of the men who had been captured. The Canadians were gathered at North Point Camp, where I'm putting my cursor now. This was a camp that had been set up for refugees, Chinese refugees, by the British. It had then been used by the Japanese when they were invading to stable their animals. And the number of people it was meant to be occupied by was 300, and now there were 1,700 men crammed in here. So the first weeks and months, actually, of the incarceration for the Canadians was a terrible time in which they were starving. They had nothing to do. There was no escape. And the diseases that were associated with their poor food and poor water began to be a very difficult problem. In the spring of that year, 1942, the Japanese then began to transport Canadians north to Kowloon, where they wanted to extend the airport. And so the men were put to work with picks and shovels to do that kind of work. By August of 1942, the worst that could happen happened, which was a diphtheria epidemic. And between August and September, I think 38 men died from diphtheria. And at that point, the Japanese chose to move all the Canadians onto the Kowloon side and sent them to Shamshui Po camp without any concern about the fact they were bringing in men that still had diphtheria. The status that they were in at this point was about as bad as it gets. And I will read you now. By the end of 42, the state that these men were in. My father kept a secret diary, and he, being one of 4 doctors, was of course in the middle of trying to deal with all of the problems. And he writes, Rifleman X is not so well as some of his fellows, but much better than others. He can and does go on work parties, at least part of the time. He is very thin, having lost 20%, on average 36 pounds of his former body weight, and he appears about 50 years old, though his real age is 30. There are cracks at the corner of the mouth and patches of dermatitis in and around the nose. He has a deep ulcer on the calf of the left leg. His tongue is sore, smooth and red, with a deep furrow down the center. 2 teeth are chipped from biting on pebbles in his rice, and several other teeth are grossly carious, so that he has difficulty in chewing his food. He complains he cannot read ordinary print, but he can make out newspaper headlines. Bright sunlight causes excessive lacrimation. He complains of constriction, like a band around his chest. His history includes malaria with 2 relapses, and he has just recovered from one of several attacks of diarrhea. He states that both lower extremities are numb from thigh level to the toes. The right great toe is deformed where a tropical ulcer has healed. He staggers in the dark, but manages moderately well in the daytime. He has some numbness of the hands, especially the fingertips. Nocturnal frequency of urination has disturbed his sleep for so long that he regards it as an integral part of his existence. He does not appear greatly concerned over the usual anxieties of life. A month after that assessment, the Japanese said they were going to send 660 Canadian prisoners to Japan to work as slave laborers. And this was something the Japanese were doing from all of their occupied territories. These men, who were in no state to be moved for any reason, were chosen and given inoculations. And the Canadians were told that one officer was to go with them, and he was to be a medical officer. My father was one of the 2 junior medical officers, but straws were drawn, and he got the short straw. So in late January 1943, he was the commanding officer of 663 troops who were marched down to a ship in Kowloon Harbor and shipped to Nagasaki. From there, they were put on a train. About 160 of the men under him were taken off the train near Kobe to work at the Omine mine there. And Reid and the rest of the 500 continued to Yokohama. And there began the longest period of single place incarceration with my father in command. From January 1943 on, 2.5 years, he was in command of all of these men, in charge of their needs as a medical officer and also serving all the duties as a line officer in command of them. And this was for a man who had 5 weeks training as an officer at Lansdowne Park and had never fired a shot in his life. The situation he found himself in was the Yokohama Camp, 3D it became named, was close by the Nippon Kokan shipyard, which was the largest Japanese shipyard, and that was where the men were going to work at all sorts of chores to do with shipbuilding or repair. The camp was about 2 miles from the shipyard, and that was what the men had to march to and from each day. My father's main concern, given that the men were not being fed properly, that it was colder here in Japan, and that they were poorly clothed, was to keep as many men off work as he possibly could at any given time. So this was the fight he had with the Japanese constantly, of those he said were too sick to go to work, and they're saying no, they weren't. What he began to explore, though, was how he could make things better for them. The commandant of this camp was a man named Masao Yoramori, and Yoramori was a man who'd been a stockbroker before the war, and he had a little bit of English. And in my father's probing way, he began to see how he could, in some ways, psychologically try to manipulate this man's view of what he was doing as commandant. And slowly but surely, this began to work. The relationship that my father was able to create with Yoramori became more and more useful in my father getting what he wanted, and other needs that had to be met that hadn't been up to this point. At this point, there were no medicines, and he had very few things to work with. But with his cooperation from Yoramori, he was able to go out with some of the staff and begin to, on the black market, buy medicines and other things that were required, like bandages. So time carried on through 1943 until later that year, the Japanese began to see how much work the men could do on reduced rations, which they began to reduce month over month. And my father's response to this was, "We are in for a disaster if you continue this." And so it happened. The winter of 1943-44 saw 14 of my father's troops die, 11 of them from pneumonia, which was the cruelest way to go because there were no drugs to help them, and it was helpless to do anything for them. This was the nadir of their experience, and through 1944, the health of the men improved in part because of one extraordinary happening that took place, and that was some of the men managed to sabotage the entire shipyard by planting what could be called a firebomb. It was a candle that was scheduled to burn down several hours after the men left the shipyard and start a fire, which it did. And this meant that the shipyard itself was incapacitated for a number of months, and the men were unable to work. And this, of course, made things much easier for them. Through 1944 and into the later part of that year, it became clear that the war was not going well for the Japanese. The early signs were that American planes very high up were flying over to begin taking photographs of where they were going to be bombing in future. And it became clear that there was a change in the Japanese demeanor. 44 into 45, this became more and more clear, and the bombing actually began to become quite serious as the Americans got closer and closer. The response at this point was to try and protect the men in the camps they were in. But as the bombing got worse, it was decided the men should be moved, the Canadians and the Americans should be moved away from targets, as it looked like the war might well end with the Allies winning. My father's regret in 1945 in March was that Yoramori, who'd been such a help to him, was taken out of command because he was considered too soft on the Canadians. And perhaps that could be considered true. but it would probably be because of my father's manipulation. In the spring of 45, the men were split into different camps. My father was sent with 200 men to Sendai, and sorry, I'm moving now to show you where we are. This is where they landed. And this is where Camp 3D was, just outside Tokyo in Yokohama. And now we've discussed the move in May 1945. Sendai Camp 1B is here on the east coast of Japan. The men here were joining two groups. There was a Dutch-Japanese group that had been there for several years, and some British soldiers who'd been part of the team that built the Death Railway in Burma. And so these two groups of prisoners were in terrible shape. The arrival of the Canadians and my father made a difference. And as things were straightened out with the help of the Canadians, things got somewhat better. But the work they were doing there was coal mining, and it was of the worst conditions. They were down in terribly hot conditions, terrible air, and there was always the fear of falling coal and wounds of that sort. Through the summer of 1945, what was going on in Japan was the struggle between Hirohito, the emperor, and his warlords as to how to end the war. The prisoners in Camp Sendai 1B were aware of the incursions of the Americans, and they knew things were getting to a point that likely there was going to be an invasion. And the great concern for the prisoners, of course, was that they might be murdered should that take place. As it turned out, that did not happen. And in August 1945, Hirohito and the Japanese capitulated, and the men were freed. So for my father, the end of 44 months of captivity was his chance to return home and start a life afresh. I've missed this slide too, and I should have shown this earlier. This is the group at Camp 3D. This is some of the camp staff. And in the center here is Masao Uramori. And as you can see, they're a pretty tough looking bunch. My father arrived back in Canada in October 1945, and this is a picture when he was in Ottawa to be debriefed of his experience. And as you can see, he shows the wear and tear of his time away. He and my mother, of course, were overjoyed to be together again. And the great friend my father had made in prison camp, George Pollock, the US naval officer I mentioned earlier, was returned to New York City, where he lived. And this picture shows them at the Copacabana nightclub in New York in December 1945. This was the beginning of the post-war, obviously, segment of my father's life. And it's hard to know after that 4 years what changes had taken place within him. His return to medical practice in Toronto was coupled with the birth of my older brother, Tony, and they're settling into a domestic life in Moore Park, Toronto. But what was noticed over the next couple of years was the restlessness my father showed. He was offered positions that he was unsure he wanted to take, and he was toying with the idea of returning to Vancouver, where he had a residency. In the midst of all this, the war crime trials were going on in Tokyo, and he understood that Uramori, his commandant, was going to be tried for war crimes. This angered him greatly as he felt this was unfair, and he wrote an affidavit in favor of Masao Yoramori and explaining that he had done, Masao Yoramori had done all he possibly could for the man while they were incarcerated. He then learned that the trial had gone ahead, and he wrote another affidavit, and I'd like to read you what he said and what was read out at the trial in Tokyo in May 1947. Reid says, "I could go on recalling incidents for some time, but I feel that these will give you a skeleton picture of the man. Such a state of cooperation was, of course, not obtained overnight. It took several months of constant effort, largely on my part, to establish such a frame of mind in Lieutenant Yoramori. But several decades of such efforts would not have established it in other Japanese commandants I have known. One must also consider that Lieutenant Yoramori was a Japanese propagandized to feel that we were the bitter and treacherous enemies of Japan, that he had never been in a Western civilization, that he was an officer in the Japanese army acting under orders that were certainly not favorable to us as prisoners, and that physical punishment, drumhead justice, semi-starvation, the inadequate care of the sick, and the lack of dignity and the value of the individual were not only part and parcel of his army's organization and philosophy, but of the life of his whole country, in order to understand that he required personal qualities of fairness and consideration to be so far won over by any means. To sum up, I did not observe any actions under the circumstances for which I would feel Lieutenant Yoramori should be punished as a war criminal." The result of that testimony was that Yoramori was given a suspended sentence and was freed a few months later and was able to return home to his family. He wrote a letter to my father a year later, which is in the book. My father and mother, as I say, set off on their post-war life together. My brother Tony was born in 1946, and I was born in 1948. In 1948, right after my birth, my father decided, after much indecision, that he would return to Vancouver and join the clinic he'd been part of when he was there as a resident in 1940-41. He left alone, and my mother followed 6 weeks later with her two sons. And during that time, my father met another woman. Catherine Gillies was a nurse who had trained and just missed out in being part of the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps because of when she graduated. She was a young woman, 8 years younger than my father, who had a tragedy of her own in her life. In 1946, she traveled to Ecuador to work as a nurse with an American mining company where she had met an engineer to whom she became engaged. At an engagement party, there was some joshing by the pool, and her fiance fell and hit his head and died on his way to the United States from his head injury. The sudden explosion of this affair between my father and Catherine Gillies was not understood by my mother for many months. This took place through 1949 into 1950, when my father continued to practice medicine, was attached to the hospital of the Vancouver General Hospital. And she was living now in the home that they had bought at 5388 LeBurning Street in Shaughnessy. In 1950, Catherine, out of wedlock, gave birth to their son in August. And at that point, my father, of course, had to confess the situation that had developed. I must say that after the circumstances he'd been through, and as we say, not knowing in any way what the trauma had meant to him, that falling in love with another woman is not unheard of in the history of men and women. What became the difficulty for my parents and for my father and for Catherine Gillies herself was, again, this great difficulty of indecision that my father experienced. His testimony to my mother was that he was mad, unbalanced, not well, and that she must stick with him. At the same time, he was saying to the other woman, I need you, I love you, you must never leave me. So persuasive was he, and in both directions, and especially with my mother, given their long-standing relationship and my mother's hope that he would return to her. He managed to continue this double relationship for 6 years. Now that sounds incredible, but it was the wish of my mother to try to help my father recover. And it was my father's wish to pursue this other relationship while not letting go of my mother for whatever reason. What one would normally do is say, my destiny is now here, we have to say goodbye, and he wasn't able to do it. The result was, it was my mother's decision in 1954 when she finally realized things were not going to work out. And she made the decision to leave Vancouver and return to Toronto with her two young sons, where Tony and I grew up. My father settled down. He and Catherine Gillis had 4 children in the end. But through the 1950s, when he would come in the summer to see Tony and me for a couple of weeks each year, he continued to send letters to my mother that still sounded as though he wanted both of them to think that things could work out in the end. Of course, it was madness, but there was something that had gone wrong in his calculation of what was right and wrong and what he could accept. And it was only time that made the situation solidify into what it was, that he was in Vancouver with his new family and we were in Toronto. In 1974, my father suffered an infection of encephalitis, a sudden onset, that is a viral infection of the brain, an inflammation of the brain. Normally, a healthy person can throw this off with antibiotics and recover completely. The belief was, with the medical help he was getting, that the margin of recovery that he was capable of because of his war injuries was very, very limited. And in fact, after the onset of encephalitis, he was never physically or mentally himself again, to the point that within a very short time, it was clear he would be unable to practice medicine any longer. The next 4 to 5 years were a very difficult time for the family, and the time that he was going through most of this, we in Toronto were hardly aware. We were not told, and we were at a distance. I've missed another, sorry, I'm skipping. This is my father and mother and Tony and me while we were in Vancouver. This is Jack and Kathy, now installed at Laburnum, what used to be our house. And now we are post the encephalitis in 1974. As you can see, my father's head is shorn from a brain biopsy. This is about 6 months after he'd been stricken. And the boy who is left is my half-brother, Jock, who was being married that day. But you can see the change in my father. And in the years that passed after this, it only got worse. He died in 1979. That's briefly the story. What happened to my father was a set of circumstances that happened to all of the men who survived the fighting at the Battle of Hong Kong, the Canadians. They all were marked, they were all damaged in one way or another. And what I'm going to play you now is a video that records part of the preface I wrote for the book. And the major portion of it is a letter that was written by Robert Warren, who was a Lance Corporal in the Canadian Provost Corps, a letter he wrote in 1990 in response to a letter from my brother Tony asking for information about our father. I hardly knew my father. After my parents' final separation in 1954, he remained in Vancouver. My mother, brother, and I moved back to Toronto, where Tony and I grew up. Throughout our childhood, we saw him once a year. He would come east in the summer and take the two of us to his father's cottage in Muskoka for a 2-week visit. When Tony and I were young, we were enthralled to be with him, our dad, a handsome, charismatic war hero. But as the summers passed and we matured, we became increasingly frustrated that he kept avoiding the discussions we were hoping he would have with us. It was as though the crucial events that had changed his life, and by extension ours, the war and imprisonment, the breakup of our family, had never happened. After the Muskoka visit stopped, I saw him 3 times before he died in 1979. In the years of writing The Captain Was a Doctor, I have tried to plumb the depths of a significant and complicated life. During the war, Captain John Reid was placed in exceptionally difficult circumstances, and for 44 months, he rose to meet them. But he was a casualty of his ordeal. How that was so for my father and for all the men who were captured at Hong Kong is best told by one who was there, Lance Corporal Robert Warren of the Royal Rifles. 45 years after the war, he wrote the following letter. In order for a prisoner to survive, he must shut down his feelings. He functions with only those feelings that help him to survive and keep him sane. During my entire internment, I did not see one person cry. No one. The feeling that we could not suppress was uncertainty. The moment we were taken prisoner, we were being terrorized, undergoing extreme emotional stress. We didn't stop to ponder it because we were busy adjusting to a hostile environment. The irony is that when you have adjusted to a bad environment, you are mentally ill. In striving to survive, we were conditioning ourselves for neurosis and psychosis in our normal world. We toughened ourselves and suppressed compassion and empathy to a point where it became non-existent. God only knows what it did to us spiritually. It certainly left scars, many indiscernible. When we returned home, one of the most serious problems was our inability to express our feelings. So we moved around among our friends and relatives with everything locked up inside. The feelings were there, manifested in nervousness, anxiety, rage, nightmares, and countless other symptoms more subtle. Those of us who did not drink ourselves into an early grave still struggle with them. I hope this writing will help you resolve some of the feelings you have regarding your father. It will no doubt sadden you, but you will come to rationalize it, gain a better understanding of his behavior, and realize that it was the war that deprived you of him as you would have wanted him to be. Only the war.